Good morning. Today is Wednesday, June 30th, 2021. Let me pose a question. How many of us consider ourselves a Zionist? Now, for those of us who answer yes, I have a follow-up question. For those of us who are in, let's say, North America, for example, how is it possible to call yourself a Zionist if you don't live in Zion, if you don't live in Israel, if you're in Montreal or some other place like that? In what meaningful sense do you say that you're a Zionist if you're not living in Israel? So, this is a debate that has gone on for a long time. And a couple of years ago, a colleague of mine wrote an article, somewhat controversial, and here's what he said. He said, I was in Israel recently. He lives in North America. I was in Israel recently, and someone said to him, "Nu, when are you moving to Israel?" Now, I just have to say that I relate to that because every time I'm in Israel, there are a number of people that ask me the same question. The answer that I give is different than the answer that I'm going to present now first. But what he said in this article that he wrote, he said he decided this time he was not going to give the usual answer as he describes it, that we're thinking about it or we hope to do it soon or something like that. His answer was, no, we're not planning to move to Israel. And that conversation got him to think about, what does it mean to call yourself a Zionist? He certainly calls himself a very ardent and strong Zionist. What does it mean to call yourself a Zionist if you don't actualize the opportunity to live in Zion? Can you still call yourself a Zionist? And he writes, yes, you can. First, he says, Zionism cannot be dependent on physical location by itself because there are Jews living in Israel who define themselves as anti-Zionist, and there are many Jews throughout history living outside of Israel who did such great things for the state of Israel that without whom the state of Israel would not exist. He gives the example of the Rothschild family, and then many, many more. But this is what he says. And certainly a person who lives in Israel, and let's just be respectful, they are a Jewish Israeli person and they support the proposition of BDS. They believe that it is the right thing to boycott the settlements. Okay, I don't agree with that. He doesn't agree with that. But let's just say there are Israelis. Are you going to call that person more of a Zionist because they're in Israel than a person who fully embraces the support of Israel in every inch and does many, many things to help to build it? How could you define Zionism based on geography alone? Okay. So therefore, he says, what does it mean to be living outside of Israel and to be a Zionist? He says it means two things. There are two components. One is belief, the other is action. The belief is to believe that the historical land of Israel remains the homeland of the Jewish people for all time, and no exile, no ideology, no politics can create a wedge between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. So, first, Zionism is an ideology, and it has a system of beliefs. That's the first component. And the second component is actions. A person, if they want to call themselves a Zionist, means, regardless of where they're physically living, that they take action to support the ongoing existence and flourishing of the state of Israel and the land of Israel. So it's an ideology and it's a practical aspect. He writes, Zionism is not just about where we are. Zionism is about who we are, what we believe, what we do. No matter where I am a Zionist. Okay, that's his contention. I partially disagree with that. I agree that a person can be a Zionist and live, for example, here in Montreal. There are many great Zionists living outside of Israel who do tremendous things for the state of Israel, the land of Israel, the people of Israel. No question about that. And so the belief and the actions are absolutely critical. But I think he's missing one last component. And that is an essential part of Zionism, certainly of religious Zionism that I consider myself a part of, is to actually want to live in Israel. Now, it is true that there are many reasons, some valid, some not valid, that a person may have for not being able to live in Israel. And that's a personal decision that each one of us has to make. But to give up the dream of living in Israel, to give up wanting to make it a reality or trying to make it a reality, that is something that is a necessary component of what Zionism should be, in my opinion. A person should want and try to fulfill the mitzvah of Aliyah, of moving to Israel. I will tell you personally, I personally would like to fulfill that mitzvah. It is my dream to fulfill that mitzvah. I have to confess, it's not on my radar now. I don't see in my own life right now how that could work out. But it is a dream that I have. Now, I want to be very clear in saying I would never tell anyone else how to be a Zionist, or whether you are a Zionist, whether you're not a Zionist. That's not for me to say. That's not for any of us to say. Each person can define themselves and define what they believe in and what they feel for themselves. But personally, my personal opinion is, I believe, for me, that being a Zionist is an ideology. It is a practical, real-life plan of action, of support, of strengthening, of feeling oneness with what happens to the people of Israel and what's happening in Israel. And it is also, for those of us not in Israel, a yearning to fulfill this dream, a yearning to be in the place that is the destiny of the Jewish people, that is God's gift to the Jewish people. And even if that yearning is not fulfilled, the yearning itself is critical. The dream itself is critical, because what that means is the feeling that when I am here in Montreal, I am missing something. There is something that is uncomfortable with my Jewish life. That, in my opinion, is an essential component of what I consider to be my Zionism. Today we're in the midst of the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. This is the period of the calendar that we commemorate led to a rupture between the Jewish people and the land of Israel almost 2,000 years ago through Churban, destruction, Golus, exile. For us, especially here, not in Israel, these 3 weeks should be a heightening of that yearning to repair the rupture, at least to want to repair the rupture between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. It is happening on a national basis. Thank God we see it happening in Israel today. And I hope to speak about that over the next few days. We see it happening in Israel. But I believe, and I feel for myself, that it should also happen for us on a personal level, on an individual level. It should be in the hearts of every one of us, this yearning, this dream, this feeling of being religiously, Jewishly incomplete outside of Israel. This is something that we should have in our hearts at all times, especially during these 3 weeks. My friends, I want to wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing all of you soon in person.